In the summer of 1885, a dying man sat on the porch of a rented cottage in upstate New York, working through unbearable pain to finish a book before his own body ran out of time. Ulysses Grant had throat cancer. He had also, through a financial scandal that wiped out his savings, left his wife facing real poverty unless he could produce something worth selling before he died. What he chose to spend those final agonizing months writing was not a settling of scores, and it was not, as so many people assume, a quiet tribute to the brilliance of the man who had opposed him in Virginia. What Grant actually wrote about Robert E. Lee, in his own words, with nothing left to gain or lose, complicates almost everything popular memory has decided about how these two men regarded each other. A myth Grant deliberately took apart. There is a widely repeated idea that Grant, like nearly everyone else in the 19th century, viewed Lee as something close to a military demigod, an opponent so gifted that simply facing him required a kind of reverence. Grant addressed this exact assumption directly in his memoirs, and he did not confirm it. He wrote that the natural disposition of most people is to clothe the commander of a large army they do not personally know with almost superhuman abilities, and that a large part of the Union Army, along with most of the Northern press, had done exactly that with Lee. Grant then added the line that undercuts the entire myth in a single sentence. He said he had known Lee personally and knew that he was mortal, and that it was just as well he felt that way. This was not false modesty. It was Grant explaining, in plain language, why he had never let Lee's reputation intimidate him the way it visibly intimidated other Union commanders. Less anxious about Lee than about someone else entirely. Perhaps the single most revealing line Grant ever wrote about Lee is also the most understated. Speaking with journalist John Russell Young, Grant said plainly that he never ranked Lee as highly as some others in the Army did, and that he never felt as much anxiety with Lee in front of him as he did when Joseph Johnston held that position instead. This is not the assessment of a man who considered Lee unbeatable. It is the assessment of a professional peer, comparing one Confederate general against another, and concluding that a less famous name actually gave him more to worry about. What Grant believed actually made Lee formidable. Grant did not dismiss Lee's abilities outright, but where he did give Lee credit, he was careful to specify exactly what kind of credit it was. He described Lee as a good man who had nearly everything in his favor, a man, in Grant's own phrase, who needed sunshine. Lee had the unanimous support of the entire South behind him, a substantial and vocal faction of sympathizers in the North, and the goodwill of much of the outside world watching the war from a distance. Grant considered all of that an enormous strategic advantage, one that had almost nothing to do with battlefield genius and everything to do with circumstance. He went further, taking direct aim at a specific claim that circulated among some of his own officers, the idea that the Army of Northern Virginia was simply a superior fighting force, man for man, compared to the Army of the Potomac. Grant said he did not believe that, except to the extent that Lee's advantages in support and sunshine had made it appear true. The line he snapped when his own officers flinched. Grant's refusal to treat Lee as unbeatable showed up most sharply not in his memoirs, but in the field, during the brutal fighting in the wilderness in the spring of 1864. When one of his own officers grew anxious and urged a retreat, worried about what Lee might do next, Grant lost his patience in a way that produced one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. He told the man he was heartily tired of hearing about what Lee was going to do, adding, with open sarcasm, that some of them seemed to think Lee was about to turn a double somersault and land in their rear and on both their flanks at the same time. It is a moment of real exasperation, aimed directly at the exact kind of reverence Grant spent his memoirs trying to dismantle. He was not fighting a legend. He was fighting a man, and he wanted the officers under his command to remember that. The human being Grant actually described. None of this amounted to personal contempt. When Grant sat down to describe Lee as a person rather than as a strategic problem, his portrait was measured and specific rather than dismissive. He called him a large, austere man, likely difficult for subordinates to approach. At their meeting in the McLean house parlor, Grant noted the contrast between them without resentment, observing that he himself had arrived in a plain traveling coat with no sword, while Lee stood before him in an entirely new dress uniform and an expensive sword, 6 feet tall, and in Grant's own words, of faultless form. Grant added that the contrast was not something he had even thought about until afterward, when he had time to reflect on how the two of them must have looked standing in that room together. And when the surrender was finally signed, Grant's own account of his emotional state that day directly contradicts any idea that he felt triumphant contempt for the man across the table. He wrote that he felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and so valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause that Grant nonetheless believed was one of the worst any people had ever fought for. That sentence carries 2 convictions at once without letting either one cancel the other out. Grant respected the endurance and the sacrifice of the men he had just defeated, while remaining entirely unpersuaded that their cause deserved any of it. Magnanimity that outlasted the war. Grant's regard for Lee as a fellow soldier, whatever its limits, translated into real action once the fighting stopped. He offered Lee and his army surrender terms far more generous than many in the Union expected, and when President Andrew Johnson later moved to have Lee tried for treason, Grant personally intervened to stop it, arguing that the parole terms he had given at Appomattox legally protected Lee from exactly that kind of prosecution. Grant held his position against a furious president. Whatever Grant privately thought about Lee's abilities on a battlefield, he was not willing to see the man hanged or imprisoned for accepting the surrender Grant himself had offered in good faith. Why the book itself matters. It is worth remembering the circumstances under which all of this was written down, because they explain why Grant's assessment carries more weight than most post-war reminiscences from either side. He was not writing to flatter old rivals or settle old scores for an audience of veterans. He was dying, in visible pain, racing a disease that would kill him within days of finishing the manuscript, and he needed the book to sell well enough to leave his wife something to live on. Grant had no reason left to inflate Lee's reputation to make his own victory look more impressive, and no reason left to diminish it out of old bitterness either. What he left behind reads like a man settling accounts honestly, for the last time, with nothing further to gain from getting it wrong in either direction. A corrective long before anyone was ready to hear it. The picture that emerges from Grant's own words is neither the story of a defeated genius humbling a lesser opponent through sheer weight of numbers, nor the story of 2 men locked in secret mutual admiration. Grant thought Lee was a genuinely capable general, operating with real advantages in support and public sympathy that Grant did not always have on his own side. He thought Lee was, in the end, a mortal man rather than the untouchable figure the South's post-war mythology was already beginning to build around him even before Grant put pen to paper. He respected what Lee's soldiers had endured without ever agreeing that their cause deserved the sacrifice. And when the war was over, whatever competitive edge had defined their years facing each other across a battlefield gave way to something closer to professional decency, extended by a dying man who had nothing left to prove.